So just a reminder for those who are streaming this, please join us by chat, post something through chat so I get a sense that, that you are attending, because I do have to keep track of that. So chat page on the left-hand side of Canvas, click on that and just say hi. And we'll try to keep track of your comments and questions that come in. We got some yesterday, last class, but there were some that I missed, I see. So I'll try to pay more attention to that. Okay, cool. So announcements, apart from chat. Remember, we have the media use diary assignment coming up on September 7th. So any questions about that? If people have started that or how that's going. Richard?
Could you please explain the process in like a minute so that like the whole process as to what we were supposed to do? Because I know that we were supposed to give up something and write about
Gotcha.
But
okay.
Is that all?
So looking through the assignment, called a diary or whatever. Sorry, I can't display it full view. So you keep a diary of your media use, all of your media use for 3 days, but you don't need to keep track of person-to-person communication like telephone calls. But otherwise, if you're streaming video, audio, watching TV, participating in social media, those kinds of things, try to keep track of how much of that you do for 3 days, just to give yourself enough of an average.
Like
one of those days, give up your favorite medium, whatever it might be. If you can't handle a whole day, go for 6 hours. If you can't handle a whole 6 hours, we'll see.
Are we keeping track of like every hour?
However works better for you. The more precise you are in it, the better that you will be able to write up. However, I don't require that you turn in a spreadsheet of your use, right? You're actually writing a narrative essay. In other words, there's an example down here by Giovanna, and there it is, okay? So you track your media use in order to get an objective sense of what you actually use. Hopefully that will inform you about what you're doing, because we tend to just unconsciously use media without thinking about it. And after that, you may refer to specifics like, hey, I realize I watched 14 hours of television over 2 days. I can't believe I watched so much. Or you may not be that specific in your write-up. It may simply be, I thought I'd watch more TV, but actually I didn't watch much. I spent much more time streaming stuff on my phone. So 3 days to track all of it. There is no solid record of what you've done. Again, I've done this many times, and the more someone honestly looks at their media use and pays careful attention, the more they get in terms of understanding and personal reward out of this exercise, which is highly subjective, and it's basically what you get out of it. Those who kind of just make it all up at the last minute because they couldn't be bothered, usually you learn nothing. You wind up having a hard time writing something because it's like you're making it all up and there's no real insight. So does that satisfy your question? Okay, Jenny?
Are you okay with submission via email, or did you want
Everything should go through Canvas, please. Yeah. If you don't trust Canvas, duplicating an email is okay, but Canvas, yeah. That's how I keep track of everything. So that is due on September 7th, which would be the Thursday after Labor Day. Right? So that's another announcement. Monday is Labor Day. If you have Monday classes, don't go to class on Monday. But we're on Tuesday, Thursday. So that was a community service. Other questions about that assignment? Media use? Again, the notion of giving something up is for you to get a sense of how much you depend on it. So if you give up something that you don't depend on or don't care about, again, you won't have much to say. So as I said, I say give it up for a day, but if you can't stand giving up your favorite medium for a day, give it up for less. Just give it up long enough so that you gain some insight into how much you depend on it. 5 minutes. What? No. Yes?
So I'm just curious, you said that you've done this many, many times. What is the most popular media object that people tend to give up for a full day?
interesting. I mean, when I started, they'd give up TV, and now people are giving up their phone. Yeah, now you guys had me pinned down to like just apps, just giving up apps. That's new, because remember I haven't done this in 2 years. So I think it just is evidence of the growing, you know, all the media is moving over into mobile, basically, and everybody's practices are moving that way. So even a couple of years ago, it was like, oh, just give up your phone. So how much were you giving up? You know, I don't know. At that point, not everyone was using their phone for social media or for a lot of their streaming video, and definitely not podcasts, even 2 years ago. So it's great evidence for me how things are changing. So the answer is it'll probably be different now, but as it used to be, most people gave up their phone, and prior to that, they gave up their TV. And those are pretty much the dominant media, you know, that most people use, especially in your demographic. You know what I mean? It's like 8 years ago, everyone watched TV on TVs, you know, and now, not that much. So it's interesting. It just shows how things are changing. But this is, you know, not really for me to do any research. It's for you to understand, you know, how media has worked into your life almost inextricably. So when I ask you to extricate one and leave it aside, that's part of the idea. Okay, so the other thing was textbook accessibility. So this is, you know, the first week we're reading the textbook. So you were saying that like it's basically sold out everywhere that you're looking
I
at?
had a problem. It seems like everybody seems to have done pretty well. It's just when I tried to do it, it said it had 9 left in the warehouse, and then it was backed up because they were still printing them. I wouldn't get it till October 20th, so I just figured I didn't want to spend it if I didn't have it for 2 months. So then you said Kindle, so I was like,
Yeah,
I completely forgot about that.
right. And you don't even need a Kindle, you know, device. Yeah, you can get it on your
I just-
laptop.
that slipped my mind completely.
That's good. So it's easy to get quickly. Okay,
That'll work.
great. So hopefully that means everyone's doing well, getting the textbook, and there we go. And remember, in the interim, there are 3 copies on reserve in the library, so you can read it in there. And there's the Kindle version, which you can download and rent just pretty quickly, easily. Okay, boom. So we're done with that. Looking into our modules here, week 1, we're through with week 1. We're on to week 2, so you should be seeing the PowerPoints that are up there, and that's about all that you'd see. I have a couple of extras stashed back there. So today we're digging into chapter 1 of the textbook, which does a number of things, and so we'll talk today about part of it, and then on Thursday we'll finish up. So couldn't quite figure out the title, Opting into Today's Media. I guess the idea there is that a lot of the media forms that we have now are much more optional than they were before, in the sense that we're working with a huge number of different media, and a lot of them are sort of more interactive than traditional broadcast media were. Anyway, a bit of an open question to me as to what opting into all of it was. So this chapter really gives like a big picture of the development of electronic media, and you'll see that in chapter 2, it's devoted to radio. Chapter 3 is devoted to television. So they'll go into more historical detail on these important mass media in the upcoming chapters. So as you can see, there was a kind of a vast historical sweeping narrative of media forms that were addressed there, from smoke signals out to different alphabets, pictographs. So all of this would be interesting stuff to talk about. But we do want to get into the electronic media sort of as quickly as we can. So we won't spend much time on the early forms of media. But just looking at this timeline that they've displayed in the book, what can you see just looking sort of, this is a linear time scale here, pretty much, I guess, in terms of where all the innovations are clustered. Sort of, what does this suggest about the pace of innovation in media when you look at this?
1960,
After the Korean War.
Pardon me?
Kind of seems like it all started after Korea.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. Are there more innovations? Are there more innovations on the left side or on the right-hand side?
Last 50 years.
Yeah, yeah. You know, from this just basic diagram, it would be not unreasonable to draw the conclusion that the pace of change has really, really picked up, and that there are so many more media innovations coming about just in the last 50 years than in all the time before. So while they were really important because they fed into this human need to communicate and changed the ways that we communicated in really radical ways. I mean, you know, the printed book was a great big deal, right? You could have a uniform piece of information that could be distributed far and wide. And that is the beginning of what we called mass media, right? So prior to that, written books had to be copied over by hand, and they were generally so precious, they would be stored in, you know, abbeys and, you know, like churches and stuff. It was basically, few books were considered, you know, how could I say, few books were allowed into the hands of the general population. Books were pretty carefully safeguarded. Thank you. I don't know why I'm having some troubles with this. I keep thinking of the film Name of the Rose. Has anyone seen Name of the Rose? Old movie. It's worth checking out. It's kind of a detective story set in a medieval abbey. But part of the plot is that people are being poisoned, and one of the ways they were poisoned is through the illustrations that the monks were doing on books. So it's actually a really nice illustration of like how early books were produced before printing came about. You know, just sort of hand painted all the time. Very entertaining movie anyway, and puts you back into a time period where books were so precious that you know, they were unique items. You know, versus now it's like digits. What are the, you know, what's your Kindle book worth? It's like you got to pay for it, but I mean, it's like, what is that? There's nothing material there, you know. So that might be another thing you could think about, is the dematerialization of media. Anyhow, the book goes into quite a lot of detail there in terms of these innovations. But I thought that we could look at maybe a few really big moments instead. And one of those we've just been talking about, which would surely be the rise of the mass media. And so by mass media, we could define that in the most broad terms possible, sort of saying, well, one source reaches a whole mass of people. So that would be a one-to-many pattern of consumption, you know, or a media distribution. So when the book comes about, you know, the printing press it was originally a wine press, and they made movable type so that they could print different books by arranging the letters that, you know, one after the other. It's like really painstaking, but you could do it, and then you'd press an ink copy a book, and eventually you could get enough of those, you could distribute them. Of course, it was the Bible in the beginning because that's what they felt was the only, you know, important book to send that about. But later on, there was others. So that's the beginning of one source, you know, the Holy See, the Church, being able to distribute books on a mass level. And then, you know, that develops through our different media. An interesting historical moment, I guess, is you know, when we get into electronic media, the telegraph is the first of those electronic media. And, you know, that was a point-to-point type of communication. So let's put the telegraph up here. and it would be a one-to-one if you want, or point-to-point if we're going to be technical. So that's the idea, that you could send the equivalent of a letter or a message by telegraph, and the electronic transmission was the big deal about it because it moved a message, with no delay from one physical location to another. So that in itself was a transformative medium for, life in the United States, let's say, because all of a sudden you used to have a lag in time of the distribution of information. It would take a few days for a newspaper to go from one city to another. You set up a telegraph and the messages are transmitted instantly, not just personal messages, but business messages. Cost of a pound of flour in Philadelphia, right away, you could get it cheaper in Pittsburgh or something like that. And so, in terms of business, that has a huge impact because you can start what they call arbitrage, the idea that you could buy cheap in one place and sell more expensive in another. So commercial information moving along at the speed of electricity changes society in a way there. It opens up a lot of different businesses and stuff like that with the telegraph. But it remains a kind of a point-to-point form of communication, although you could, for instance, take the daily index of the stock market in New York, and you could print those numbers in a newspaper that you publish somewhere else. So that point-to-point could become part of a mass medium, a one-to-many medium, which one-to-many back in those days would have been a newspaper. You'd print out a newspaper and sell a ton of copies of it, and you'd have a one-to-many type of deal. What's interesting is when you got into radio, and we'll talk about this more in detail next week, but when Marconi started, showing off this invention, radio, in the United States, they talked about radio telegraphy. The idea was that, now we'll be able to send messages by radio waves and we won't have to string out telegraph wires anywhere. So the early radio, the American Marconi Company went into business actually delivering sort of radio telegrams instead of doing what we think of as radio now. So that's kind of interesting because it means that their thinking was not yet, they hadn't really thought of that radio could be a mass medium. They were still stuck in the telegraphy mode of one-to-one or point-to-point. Yeah?
I'm just curious, they went into business. How much was it for
I don't know. I don't know.
Ham radio?
You mean how much to buy a radio or how much to send a message?
Well, both.
Oh, I don't know. When we dig in more detail next week, let's just look in the New York Times because but the Times is archived back to the 1870s. It's like a time machine. You can go in there and look at articles written, and you can even see a page view with I hope back then, I don't know, but you can definitely read the articles. And some of them will give you the prices of like how much to send a message or how much was a radio receiver, that kind of stuff. But the whole idea of radio receivers, it took a little bit of a conceptual shift. Some people started thinking, well, maybe we could actually use this and send out audio information to a whole bunch of people at once. And then they started to ask themselves, well, how can we pay for that? How are we going to do that? Is everyone going to have to pay extra? And then they thought, advertising. Oh, okay. So that's a really interesting thing we can look at next week is the way that they figure out radio could be a mass medium, a one-to-many, while they were thinking it was really going to be a one-to-one. That's where they would make their money. Then one-to-many, but how do we make money? Then they realize, advertising. So I think that's a big development as people start seeing the money in mass media and this one-to-many model. And then, the next one, as they say, the internet, the paradigm breaker. I mean, I think digitization deserves a shout out there as being an important thing in the 1980s. Just to be able to expand the number of channels and change the kind of quality of media that we were getting. So starting in the 1980s, there's a move to digital media, especially like in television transmission, for instance. Makes a big difference in terms of how much television you can move around the country and how many channels an individual can get. So digitization, I think, is another key moment. But finally, the internet, or basically computer networking, would be, introducing what could be called a many-to-many form of communication. That, I think, is probably another of the most important moments of getting from smoke signals to where we are now. This many-to-many pattern is something that we're still trying to deal with, because it's pretty complex. So we got a little video, which is it goes into this, and it uses a slightly different terminology, which it's kind of fun. So let's look at it. It doesn't last that long. And where did it go?
I think it's your third tab.
My third tab?
Oh, no, never mind.
Somewhere in there. Oh, well, we'll find it. If we're in the modules, we're in the modules. A brief history of the media. Here we go. Thanks for your help, guys. Boom. And Jody wants me to go full screen here. What's up? Did it sort of say that it already played it?
You have to.
Oh, dare it. This would be, oh, that's share. How do I go full screen here?
You start play, then hit full screen.
Start play and then hit. There we go. Turn off lights.
So I'm going to go a little academic on you. Forgive me. We're in a university. Journalists, and tech folks don't look back very much. They look either at the present or ahead. So I'm going to break that cycle and go back a little in time to talk about the history of media. I think using a software framework of version numbers that maybe 0.1 is the cave-dwelling paintings, long time ago, 15,000 years. Maybe the papyrus, the printing on something like paper, creating something like, later on, books, is a 0.5, I don't know, close enough for me. The next big change is actual books. And in this case, this is the scribes, the priests who are creating books by copying the Bible into new books. Pretty familiar form, though it was being done by hand. That changed pretty dramatically right after that with Gutenberg and his printing press. Also the Bible, that's Mr. Gutenberg there in the center of that picture. And that was liberating the Word of God from the control of the priests. Fairly significant event. Maybe the political pamphlets of the revolutionary times are at kind of 1.1. Another persuasive use of printing to convince people of something. It was politics this time causing revolutions. The telegraph wasn't media precisely, but an amazing tool, and it was media in the sense that it was something transmitted over a long distance really fast, no longer the speed of a horse, but the speed of light. The newspaper, magazine, book of the late 19th, early 20th century, kind of the pinnacle, I think, of the print era. I don't mean to compare the Times with the Titanic, forgive me, Joe. But this is a major thing, but not as major as broadcast. The radio comes along, right? And all of a sudden, one-to-many at the speed of light over long distances with people scaring us like Orson Welles or calming us like FDR. The TV in the mid-20th century. Clearly another major change, not as big as what we've had, but the events like the debates and then the moon landing watched by a majority of people on the planet who were in places where they could. This is sort of the pinnacle of broadcast, although I kind of hate to say that. The biggest difference, of course, in this is that instead of 3 channels, there's 300 to 500 on your average set. And now here we are. Packet switching, ones and zeros, speed of light, one to many, many to many, dramatic like the book and like the broadcast era in change. But remember the legacy model of what we did in the 20th century, which was the production of media, and then it was a manufacturing process. You manufactured it, then you put it in trucks or sent it out over the airwaves. Not what we do now. Now we create stuff, we put it online, and other people come and get it. That's totally different than what we did in the past. We should really understand how different that is, because it helps us create a whole new ecosystem. And this is the beginnings of a news ecosystem. This is not even close to where we are, but it's a start, and that's why I'm so excited, because it's going to be diverse in ways it was never diverse in the past. The possibilities when the consumers morph into not just creators but collaborators with things like Wikipedia and the things we do with these collaborative tools is immense. And we haven't even begun to figure that out, where it's going. But some of the things that are coming, this is one of my favorites. This is adding not just collaboration, but sensor data, human and machine sensors, in this case to look at the radiation around Fukushima. So I'm kind of worried about 4.0, about the taking back of control into a few hands. I don't think this scenario is the most likely one, but it's a possibility and it scares me. I worry this is closer because this is how Hollywood, the cartel, the copyright cartel, and the government, they kind of like the internet to work this way if they could do it. And that scares the crap out of me, and it should scare the crap out of you. And we have a job. We have to reassert in our future history that this is ours. It's not theirs. We're going to innovate at the edge, and we're going to save it, I hope, for ourselves. Thank you.
Hey. Any thoughts on what you heard? Dan Gilmore is a professor at Annenberg School of Communication, a very famous university. Yes. Yeah? Folks? Ideas? Oh, yeah, Sandra?
One of the first things I thought of when I was reading the chapter, and like I kind of was reminded of watching that, was like, I wondered if there was a term for, like, along the lines of mass media, and it would probably relate to like the Telegraph, where it was the first one that actually was accessible to everyone intellectually. Like, I imagine at the time of like the scribes and even the Federalist pamphlets and stuff, like most people couldn't read.
Yeah.
So really only like the people that could get their hands on it and were equipped with the knowledge to like interpret them could access that information. I was just wondering if you knew any like.
Yeah, I mean, there's that's a theme that's being taken up in a certain amount of scholarship about communication, because we talked a little bit about how those scribes kind of what do we say? I couldn't come up with a word, but they kept their information very close to their chest, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. One way to interpret the vast progression that we were looking at here is a democratization of access to information and the ability to read and use it. And I think that's why Dan Gilmore is so excited at the end of the video about the potential of, consumers becoming producers, becoming, everyone entering much more closely into the chain of media production and consumption, on all levels, I think. So yeah, it's a great point. Even you needed telegraph operators. You needed a company that could actually, send your messages and stuff when you get to telegraphy. And earlier on, there was most of the population was illiterate, as you say. So they counted on the priest in front of the congregation to interpret the book for them. And when that book started to circulate, the church no longer had the authority that they used to over the Word of God. Everyone could take that book and read it and have their own interpretations of it. So yeah, it's a good point. And there's even ideas that, empires couldn't exist without adequate communication that could, enough literate bureaucrats basically in the Roman Empire so that Caesar could say something in Rome and it would get done, in Alexandria or wherever, So yeah, it's been a long process. But yeah, control of information is a big theme. Yeah. Maybe mass media. I mean, do you think that the mass media model is a very democratic type of model of information production and sharing? That's maybe theoretically, yeah. I mean, if were we to compare it with, let me just see. I have a couple of these ones up here. What model are we talking about? We're talking about this model. This is basically a kind of a mass media model where you've got, the newspaper producer or the television station owner and all your readers or viewers around it, right? So these pictures are in the textbook too, but these are just, these models are actually pretty interesting to take a look at. So if there's that model versus, the model that we're looking at now, sort of the one or many senders and the many receivers. So is there a kind of a, whoops, sorry. Let's contrast the information flow there, which is from one point out to many, to this one, from many to many. Just looking at it structurally, which one seems to you to be a more democratic model? The second one, right? Can you elaborate as to why?
It's mainly the feedback, because if it's broadcasting mass radio waves, without having to outsource to find out what the ratings are like, or doing things like getting doing phone call based contests and stuff, you're not really getting an idea of how many people are actually listening to you. So, but with the internet, it's just very easy to monitor a website and see how many clicks you're getting, and so on and so forth.
Great point. Great point. And you bring up a concept which is not even in this what they called the legacy model of electronic communication. But yeah, so in terms of what we're going here, it's kind of a one-directional flow, unidirectional from the center out to the receivers, and as you said, there's very little opportunity for them to get back into the loop of communication versus here. A many-to-many type means that, if you're communicating this way, you can also get information back through a lot of different sort of links in this model. That's a good point. I would see it that way too. Do other people see the kind of the democratic potential in this model, at least? And these are all structural models. We're not saying the internet is the best thing for democracy. Yeah, Richard?
I also see that the first model, the person or people in the middle can control all the information provided. And the second model, like information can be, let's say, fabricated in some way too. So it has a flaw in it as well. But
interesting. So with this model. Another media theory talks about gatekeepers, media producers as gatekeepers who are monitoring the information that they send out, and because it's kind of centrally controlled, the gatekeepers can control the flow of information into the communication system. Versus now, Richard makes a great point that here we don't have a central control. So if one of these nodes is not reliable, there are fewer gatekeepers, and there's more potential for perhaps misinformation or disinformation. Sandra?
Also, the communication between the receivers of the information, with the internet, sometimes I'll consume a piece of media, like a song or a book or something, and I'll think it's fine, and I'll go on the internet and see what other criticisms other people have had, and I'll be like, yeah, you're totally right, that sucks. I won't really think about some things until somebody else brings it to my attention.
Yeah.
So that I guess communication between people that are consuming is important. important too.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you look at a more modern model, a more current type of model, I think they're trying to get at what you're talking about here in the sense that you'd still have a media organization like, you know, music publisher or iTunes or whatever, and you know, many people could get the music in many different ways. But I think what they're accounting for here with these kind of interconnections back in the mass audience, quote unquote, is, you know, just what you're talking about, the ability for the audience to kind of to be more aware of what's going on in you know, change your opinion perhaps of the song that you heard, you know, versus again, a more mass communication model, which is perhaps, it's perhaps overly simplistic about this, but the idea is you'd listen to the song and you'd be kind of there in your own bubble consuming that song. But that wouldn't take account of, you know, the actual interpersonal, you know, things. Before the internet, people would get together in their homes and watch, you know, Twin Peaks or something like that. And they'd, what is that all about? I don't know, you know what I mean? Or so there was an interpersonal way of you know, sharing information about other stuff. But definitely, you know, social media brings that online and makes it far more accessible to us. And even for researchers, we can look at the comments section of YouTube or something and go, my God, people are so rude. But, you know, we can also see like how you know, that kind of discussion develops, you know, basically interpreting media. So that was interesting. Yeah.
What's this model called? Is this the mass, what do you call it, a social media model?
I would have to look into the textbook to let you know. Actually, in the textbook is the first time I've actually seen this model. So, one sec. Let's just see. Can someone see it? Or it's probably in the PowerPoints too. So it's Schramm and Osgood model of communication. I should actually show it to you this way with proper attribution. I thought that if I show it to you this way, we'll just be like looking at PowerPoints instead of thinking about what they say. But yeah. So yeah, let's back up here for a sec, because Schramm, part of what made his reputation as a kind of a communication theorist, because all of these are just attempts to model different aspects, and they require a lot of simplification in order to come up with a little model like this. But here we see an acknowledgement that media consumption involves human beings and their interpretations, you know. So decoding and encoding messages is a way that, you know, communication theorists have been talking about that for a long time. Like in this, the Shannon and Weaver mathematical model, this came up in the 1950s. And they were, you know, Shannon was working in Bell Laboratories. He was a technician, and he wanted a model of like, okay, how can we model communication in an electronic system? And actually, you know, they would be able to calculate noise and stuff. But everyone kind of jumped onto it because in the 1950s, you know, communication was the new thing, electronic communication with television coming up, and cybernetics was also, you know, the science of systems was also viewed as, you know, a new and kind of very big potential in all of that. So this being a model coming out of that was sort of applied to all kinds of communication. That there's a source of information, there's a transmitter, which, you know, works down a channel, and then there are receivers. So this was a real kind of mechanical model. And the other thing that completely leads out, which is a cybernetic term, is feedback, right? So Shannon and Weaver weren't particularly interested in what happened to the message after it reached its destination, but people thinking afterwards thought, well, this is a real one-way type of, you know, way of thinking about communication. It just comes from, let's say, you know, the NBC, the creative team, you know, transmit over the NBC network, down that TV channel, get to the receiver, and boom, they get the information. It sort of works for some types of programming, which are just simply getting information one place to another. But this idea of feedback, how does the receiver then signal anything to the source, is something that we've often left out. And as you were saying, if we look at the many-to-many model of the internet, what we're seeing is like feedback just expanding, like the potential for all kinds of messages to result in kind of feedback loops. So this came from cybernetics as well, the idea of feedback. So that's what he called the legacy model, and it was nice. They showed a picture of a truck moving that away. Gosh, I shouldn't write on the board because we need. Anyhow, cool. So built into SRAM, and you notice SRAM's later model here really accounts for feedback. That there are different sources that are basically sending messages around that way and stuff. How do you feel about the ability for this model to account for? Oh, thank you. To account for communication. Does it always work? Do producers always realize their intentions, get their message across the way they would like? Richard, you're shaking your head. What do you think?
No, it's practically not possible to give every information that they intended.
Uh-huh. So you say it's practically not possible for them to succeed in communicating as they had intended.
It's not impossible. It's not possible to give.
Okay. Okay. Can you speak up later? No, we got it. Yeah. Okay. And yeah, there's at least the potential for failure. I think we'd all agree on that. So in a model like this, it emphasizes, that there is an interpretive process going on, that people have to try to understand what's going on in a message. And that has largely been worked into these models in terms of like encoding and decoding. That you're encoding information into a message, and that someone has to decode it afterwards. Which leads to some...
which can lead to issues.
Issues. Yeah, let's say that. Are you thinking of any specific issues?
Are you referring to now or the 1950s?
Try now. Anything that comes to mind, though. I'm just trying to think of...
President would be a good example. People who are supporting him will view certain newspapers or programs or CNN or whatever differently than people who disagree with what he's doing. I think that people's views or people's environment that they're around also they'll interpret that same information differently as well. I think that's ongoing. I think it will continue even on the later electronic media, and I think it will continue changing more rapidly.
I think that is a great example of divergent forms of decoding. I think that is a great example. Is that connecting with everyone? Yeah? Yeah? Anyone want to expand on it? The notion that nowadays people live in their own kind of interpretive worlds, and it doesn't necessarily overlap. The same seemingly objective piece of information will strike different audiences in very different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if somebody doesn't like Taylor Swift or somebody does like Taylor Swift, they're probably going to listen to content that says that they like Taylor Swift or whatever case. Just depends on what it is.
Yeah.
Not to get like too tangential here, but it's also kind of throws a wrench into the mix that anything, our president has set a precedent for us that anything that you disagree with is fake news. So that kind of, I don't know, I think that kind of makes things like a little more chaotic and complicated when we're trying to like make sense of our world and be rational human beings in society.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, I'd say there's always been the possibility for alternative decodings, and now I think that, you know, it feels just like alternative realities in some ways. You know, that's what's being posited. That it really, you know, that regardless of objective fact, you know, what we want to decode is what we're going to get. Yeah, I don't think that that's a given, but it definitely feels that way. Yeah. Well, those are great examples. Those are great examples of how the kind of interpretive flexibility involved in all of this is important to account for. You know, and obviously early models couldn't really account for it too well. And yeah, we're here in a situation where there are far fewer gatekeepers. Media sources have decentralized. There's less authority in those media organizations like CBS, NBC, ABC, you know, or the presidency for that matter. And there's an enormous, you know, we're far more aware of the interpretive processes of all audience members, you know, due to this, you know, again, the social media that we're working with now. So interesting. Yeah.
I also wanted to make a point too that the beginning mass communication model, where it's only one medium to many different receivers, is that kids growing up, we could only see rated G stuff or rated PG-13 stuff, but now you go on the internet and you can see, unfortunately, rated X stuff, and no one really has control over that anymore because you can find that anywhere. No problem, unfortunately. So kids nowadays see very extreme stuff compared to in the early 1990s or 80s or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, yeah.
The internet has really, unfortunately, gotten worse. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
In a sad way.
Yeah, as you know, as we were talking, it's the same process we were talking about, democratization of information. You know, if the early priests could keep the word of God for themselves, you know, early communication systems could screen out certain audiences, selectively impart information to them, keep the smut away from the kids, keep the important business information to the stockbrokers and so on and so forth. Whereas now you have a much more kind of leaky situation. And the chapter begins to talk about regulation, which is, obviously we'll do a week on the different media regulations that are out there. But, even in this introductory chapter, it did mention, the First Amendment and then the attempts in the Communications Decency Act, which was part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the attempt to not censor content, but to regulate content on the internet, which was eventually viewed as unconstitutional. They had to take it out. So we're in a situation with a largely unregulated internet. That's true.
Wild West.
Wild West, right? Yeah, and so that's also interesting to look at, because in the early days of mass communication, Congress had no problem creating the FCC and mandated it with powers to regulate content in mass media. But that has always pushed up against the First Amendment.
That's kind of how it goes when you have when you give people like the right to do something themselves, and then try to regulate it. You can't do that. Give people the internet, or like alcohol.
And take it back, you mean?
Yeah, like you're giving them a right to do something and say, no, we don't trust you to be people. Like to give you the internet and then say what you can watch on the internet versus you have ABC, CBS, and whatever the other one was in the 70s, and you can regulate that because there's bigger companies that own it. That makes sense. But if it's the internet, you can't. You have to trust your parents or yourself to just be like, I'm not going to watch that. Other than, because then you're not trusting your people, and they understand that. If you give them the right to do something, then take it away.
Okay, I mean, that's an argument.
Or regulate it, not take it.
I think that speaks to your assessment of human psychology for sure. In terms of the regulator, their particular logic for encroaching on people's First Amendment rights was always that, you know, the airwaves are a scarce resource, and they're, you know, the property of all the citizens of the United States, and for that reason, there should be some restrictions on content, because it's like basically like a public byway. So imagine if a similar idea might be if someone could set up a soapbox outside your house and start screaming obscenities, you know, the cops would come and take them away, you know. And it's sort of the same thing if the broadcast airwaves, which are the, you know, basically a public byway of information, get filled up with the equivalent of screamed obscenities, then
Like cyberbullying.
yeah, Congress always viewed, okay, that is, we you know, there have to be some limits on the freedom of speech, which that was, you know, that has not been the case outside of broadcasting, because the argument is being, well, if you go to cable TV, you're a subscriber. It's not a public byway for information. You're buying into a private service, so we're not going to regulate cable. And the idea is, you know, if you're going to go on the internet.
But that's the kind of the exact opposite, right? I mean, it is regulation if it's TV, because, right? I mean, that's what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that the regulations, the content regulations that do exist cover only broadcast over the airwaves. Sorry, I didn't make that clear enough. Yeah, but and apart from that, Congress has abstained from trying to regulate content with that, you know, Communications Decency Act little episode, because they basically said, well, you know, if you opt onto the internet, then we're not going to regulate the content. If you opt into cable, you're not going to regulate the content. But radio waves are just like, you know, public byways, and so we will regulate that content. Jenny, sorry to make you wait.
Maybe you want to use the example of the current topic of net neutrality to expand on this.
Or maybe you could.
Well, my understanding of net neutrality is basically the government trying to infringe on the content that is published and accessible on the internet versus the, as you were mentioning, the democratization of information and information access has been the trend, if not the standard, to date.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of, I know the Democratic Party and the majority of public are against net neutrality because we don't want to go ahead and reverse the progress we've made so far, especially through the digital age of the many-to-many model, and reverse it and go back to the one-to-many model.
Right, right. Okay, thank you. Yeah. It bears more looking at. I'm not as familiar as I should be about net neutrality, which is why I kind of dumped it back on you. But, you know, those who feel that there is democratic potential in the, you know, many-to-many situation we've got on the internet, which is, you know, it's, well, whatever. The internet, like any other technological infrastructure, needs support, and it will develop. And as the huge corporations that, you know, have big investments in media in this country look to, you know, making more money and also upgrading the infrastructure of the internet, they're thinking about, you know, treating different forms of content differently. So right now the idea is simply that the internet is a neutral carrier, and that any form of message is going to have equal treatment along the network. And I think the net neutrality debate, as I understand it, and it may go well beyond that, and I'm not contradicting you, but just saying it in basically a different way, the net neutrality debate is, shall we continue to be neutral about content as on the internet, as AT&T, for instance, is neutral about what kind of phone messages go on over the telephone lines? You know, they're not allowed to charge you more for a business call then they can charge you for a personal call, right? They're supposed to like treat all telephone messages the same. But what the big corporations would like to do with the internet, of course, is to vastly improve part of it so that they can stream 4K video and God knows what else, massive amounts of data, and make lots of money out of that. And that would require a stronger infrastructure, and they don't want to invest in it unless they can get their money back by charging more for that type of data exchange. So, the net neutrality issue is, shall we keep the internet? So shall we put a brake on that kind of commercial development in order to make sure that all forms of messaging are treated equally, or are we going to allow corporations to build out part of it and then have at least a two-tier system, which many people in media studies look at it as kind of like, well, we had broadcast TV that was free for everybody, and then all of a sudden we had cable TV where you paid a premium, and they're looking at what could go on in the internet again as kind of, well, since the beginning of the internet we've had this sort of like neutral playing field, and now what happens if we allow Verizon, for instance, to beef up part of it and charge? That's sort of like creating cable subscribers, and then at that point the internet may look more like cable TV, at least in the video section of it. So it's a great point, Jenny, and later chapters will inform me more about that, so we can all talk more about it too. Anybody more fully versed on net neutrality than what we've just been into? Okay, I mean it's a pressing issue. It's just it develops pretty fast. Okay, let's see. Schramm and Osgood. Coming back to. Yeah, so is there more to say about the section of the chapter on regulation? Okay, yeah, just to dig in a little bit more to a couple of notions again about information and democracy. That seems to be something we're talking about a fair amount today, actually, which is interesting. But the idea that that a free and open exchange of ideas will result in a positive outcome. Let's put it that way. And again, with one of the examples or some of the examples that are being raised right now, the less utopian side of a free and unfettered and ungatekeepered flow of information is coming out. But some early ideas, theories of the press, which are behind these notions, is that a free and open marketplace of ideas will lead to a working out of what are the best ideas. The idea is that the public is ultimately rational. The public can figure out what's true, what's false, what's useful, what's counterproductive, and so we shouldn't regulate media content to the extent that good ideas may never see the light of day because the regulators don't feel that that people should hear about them. Then you get into censorship and sort of tyranny of information. So those two ideas, the liberal theory of the press, which was that we should have a free press that is uncensored by government, and then that alongside that notion of the concept of the marketplace of ideas, which is so American. It's like it's a marketplace, It's like if we were in a socialist country, it definitely wouldn't have a commercial metaphor. But yeah, the marketplace of ideas, in that you should, a culture is like the main street, and everybody should be able to hang up their shingle and put their ideas out there, and the public will choose. The public is wise enough to choose. What do you think, Nika?
I think
a lot of people bring into kind of like the internet censorship debate, a lot of people bring the First Amendment into it, but I see a lot of misunderstanding about that, because a lot of the time, if I was using a recent example, say, like Stormfront, the white nationalist website was taken down by GoDaddy, its provider, and I saw people saying censorship, which is not, since it's not the government, it's a private company taking down something on their service. So a lot of this is misinterpreted as First Amendment issues when they're just a company denying service to someone they don't want to serve.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. It's more complex than a lot of people give it credit for. And the First Amendment refers to government intervention, not private companies' intervention. Yeah, so I was aware of that little move, and it's interesting because it draws into question as well, because we all use these services and service providers, and they're private companies, and so our right to speech is nonetheless, doesn't extend to compelling private companies to help us speak. I guess that's the point you're making, which is a good point. Do you think the public merits the kind of trust that the marketplace of ideas or the liberal press theory gives it? The idea that the public is wise enough to discern, if we open it all up, that people will be able to choose. What do you think?
I like to be more optimistic and think they do. I think that people like to put their money where their mouth is, or they like to, the market will always speak. So if you put a new product out there, and if people want it, they'll buy it. If they don't want it, they won't buy it. Then you'll know whether or not your product was good enough for it. I think that's a good model, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Other ideas? Micah?
I'm not really big on laissez-faire, so...
Laissez-faire? Yeah, that's okay.
But I always see corporations can always make you think you want something and make you believe you need a service that you really don't, and then they monopolize that service. So you're really, it's less of a free market you're choosing, but it's like all these, so many mergers and stuff, there are monopolies everywhere, and you don't really have a choice anymore in many things.
Okay, so if I extend that commercial idea to ideology or to ideas, the kind of content that we're talking about with the marketplace of ideas, would you mean that that people are susceptible to being sold ideas that are, maybe they wouldn't otherwise go along with?
Yeah, definitely, like many sources of information present themselves as much more reputable than others, and then they shame others, which can be a good thing, and like InfoWars and stuff. But in other cases, just places that don't deserve their respect they get can rise up and influence people with information that is not correct.
Gotcha. I mean, my feeling right now sometimes is just like, it's almost like a cliffhanger. It's kind of like, will people really buy this latest, misinformation from whatever source? I mean, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, in a theoretical and ethical way, I also, would like to give the public the credit for being able to figure this out. But it just seems like in the short term, I'm always sort of clinging to that hope and saying, well, are they going to get it? Or sometimes I don't even know what's right and wrong in my own head, and I'm like buffing it back and forth,
Some bought into Pizzagate, so...
Right, yeah, which seemed like a kind of outrageous story, the idea that there was like a child prostitution ring in a pizzeria in Washington somewhere. Someone comes in with a gun, going to break that up. Wow. Richard, you had something to say.
Nothing big, but I feel like it's a numbers game. So practically there's so many social medias out there, like there are so many outlets out there that they can reach almost 7 billion people of the planet, and they only want like 1% of it to use it. So the social media is on their side, definitely 100%. I feel like this thing cannot be stopped for sure, but I feel like the people are definitely aware, like me. I'm aware, and even though I'm aware, I buy stuff because I don't. It's not that I need them. I just want them. I'm sure a lot of people here do that.
Are you talking about consumer goods or about,
I mean,
okay, ideas, ideologies? And,
anything. If I like it, I have a little. I mean, it's my human nature. I have like a little inclination to just, okay, what's that? And then I go a little deep. And then some other media talks about the same thing, and then my curiosity goes even more deeper in it. And then I see somebody else talking about it. Even if it's wrong information or something, I fall for it just because there's so many outlets out there, and then they feed them this information, right or wrong, and then they create this whole fake world or whatever, and then I feel people dive into it, but I also think that people have the capacity to get out of it once they know what it is.
It's a real challenge. I mean, the getting out of it part is, that's the most hopeful outcome, is that with hard work and the attempt to be objective and to find out the truth and, a great deal of patience, I think, I think we'll find that there's still an objective world out there, and that people are by and large rational, or that, the society comes to some rational outlook, conclusions based on all this, I guess. But I guess the other thing is it's kind of like in listening to the way you're telling the story, I'm feeling like, well, there's no way to stop this anyway. It's not as though the regulator could step in now and basically say, okay, we'll decide what's true, and it's just not going to work that way.
Unless they stop the internet, I mean.
Yeah, right. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So I think it's all on us to try to sort through what information we're consuming and on what we base our opinions on, and having the patience to see something through, because a lot of the misinformation doesn't stand up. But if you look at some of the case studies, and we'll have a chance to look at some, the misinformation is it is out and broadcast so fast that and taken as truth, that there's no time to fact check or to come back around and to figure this out. Some things which are almost ludicrous on the face of it are consumed. And so I think if you have the patience to try to sort through stuff, then I think we can still come to rational conclusions. But it's a concern. And if you want to write essays about this, and if these ideas are troubling, which they are to me, and hopefully they will be to you too, then there's plenty of thinking that you can do in a short-term paper for this class, definitely. So keep that in mind. I think we finish at 12:25, right? So let's try to wrap up a couple minutes early, because just for our online folks, so it's 12:23. So we're meeting up on Thursday and talking about the rest of the chapter. And so keep thinking about your media diaries, all right? Thanks again, a great discussion.